There are silences in the Force that are more terrible than screams. They come not from distance or death, but from blindness, when even the wise cannot see what moves beneath their feet. It was in such a silence that Yoda first felt the dark side return. The galaxy was calm, or so it appeared. The Republic thrived under the illusion of stability, its fleets patrolling countless systems, its senators clothed in rhetoric and self-congratulation. The Jedi Order, proud and weary, continued its endless cycle of mediation, arbitration, and war prevention. To most, this was the golden age of peace. To Yoda, it was an age of numbness. In his meditations, the Force no longer sang. It murmured, soft, discordant, uncertain. What had once been a symphony of life and motion now felt like an echo inside a hollow chamber. Yoda searched for the source of this imbalance, but the visions that came were fragmented, as though veiled by shadow. He saw flickers of red, not flame, but eyes. He heard voices that were not there, cold and calm, speaking of destiny and domination. The Sith. The word alone was a wound from the past, a name carried in whispers and fears. They were thought extinct, burned from the galaxy 1,000 years before. Yet the darkness Yoda felt was too deliberate to be chance. It was not rage or chaos, but purpose, like a hunter masking its scent. He brought his unease before the council, and for the first time in centuries, doubt filled the chamber. Some dismissed it outright. If the Sith had returned, we would know, said Master Windar. Others looked to politics, to the growing unrest among trade guilds and planetary factions. The threat we face, they argued, is corruption, not the Force. But Yoda's eyes stayed closed as he listened. He did not hear denial, he heard fear. Fear of believing him. And fear, he knew, was how the darkness spread. So he waited. He meditated longer. He searched deeper. Yet the more he reached, the more the shadows withdrew. It was as though something, or someone, was deliberately clouding the Force itself. The currents that once carried visions across time and space were now fogged and uncertain. Prophecy had become unreliable. Dreams bled into lies. The galaxy's great river of truth was being poisoned at its source. For the first time, Yoda felt small within the Force, not humbled, but lost. He, who had guided generations, could no longer trust the very current he swore to follow. Still, he did not speak this fear aloud. For if the Grand Master doubted, the Order itself would fracture. Yet silence is also a decision. And in that silence, the Sith grew bold. Strange events began to ripple across the Outer Rim. Pirate fleets organized with military precision. Systems once at peace turned upon each other overnight, their leaders driven by unseen influence. A senator was found dead on Coruscant, an apparent suicide, though his last transmission spoke of manipulation and deceit. Each event, isolated, appeared mundane. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. But every time the Jedi investigated, the trail vanished, erased as though the darkness anticipated their every move. Yoda meditated upon these signs until his mind blurred with exhaustion. In one such meditation, he reached beyond himself, into the deeper ocean of the cosmic force. And there, for a heartbeat, he saw it, a presence vast and coiled, patient and ancient. It did not attack. It watched. A phantom in the light. When he emerged from the trance, sweat beaded his forehead. His breath trembled. The vision had not shown him a face, only a feeling, one that lingered like a stain upon his spirit. The dark side had not merely returned, it had adapted. It hid within peace itself, twisting light to conceal its form. He tried once more to warn the council. This time, they listened, but not to believe. They listened out of respect, and then dismissed him with reason. The Force clouds all minds in times of transition, said one. Visions are not facts, said another. Even Mace Windu, closest to Yoda in philosophy, admitted uncertainty. If there is darkness, he said, it is beneath layers too deep to touch. Perhaps it is meant to remain so. Yoda bowed his head. Perhaps, he whispered. But deep within, he knew the truth. The Jedi were no longer looking for the dark because they no longer believed it could exist. Their faith in peace had blinded them to the truth that balance is never permanent, that light, unchallenged, becomes arrogance. And so, the greatest deception in galactic history began, not through conquest, but through comfort. The phantom of the dark side moved unseen. It whispered through the Senate's halls, guiding the rise of men whose ambition outweighed their virtue. It spoke through treaties and trade routes, through laws meant to preserve peace but designed to divide. It reached even into the temple, into the hearts of Jedi too certain of their own righteousness to sense their manipulation. Yoda felt it, always just beyond reach, like a memory that refused to surface. The Force had become a labyrinth, and the path to clarity grew narrower with each passing year. He questioned himself more than ever. Had he failed to teach vigilance? Had centuries of peace made the Order forget how to see beyond appearances? When he walked among the younglings now, he saw their smiles and wondered how many would one day die for a blindness they inherited from their masters. Years passed. The shadows thickened. And though Yoda's fears were never confirmed, the truth was already at work, shaping the destiny of the galaxy. In the slums of Coruscant, a child was being born, one whose lineage and suffering would give rise to a man named Sidious, a man who would master the very deception Yoda could only sense. But Yoda did not yet know this. He only knew that the silence in the Force had grown absolute, and that within that silence, something was listening. And so, the Grand Master continued to sit upon his council seat, his eyes closed, his voice calm, his doubts hidden. Yet in the stillness of his meditations, he began to understand the cruelest truth of all. Evil does not announce its return. It waits for wisdom to grow tired. The phantom of the dark side had already arrived, and the galaxy, in its serenity, had already welcomed it in. War changes everything, not through destruction alone, but through the quiet way it redefines what one believes is right. For Yoda, the Clone Wars were not only a conflict of armies, but a test of the soul, a reckoning between the ideals he had lived by and the grim necessities he could no longer escape. The galaxy burned. Across 1,000 worlds, banners of the Republic clashed with those of the Separatists. Fleets filled the skies, cities became battlefields. Once peaceful planets drowned in the echoes of artillery and the hum of lightsabers. The age of diplomacy had ended, replaced by one of calculation and survival. And at the center of it stood the Jedi, warriors draped in robes of monks, fighting a war none of them truly understood. When the first reports reached Coruscant, Yoda could scarcely believe them. A clone army, commissioned in secret, long before war had even begun. Soldiers bred for obedience, designed to fight and die for the Republic they would never truly belong to. Their creation defied everything the Jedi stood for. Yet when the galaxy trembled, when the Separatist droid legions advanced and planets fell, even the wisest of masters bowed to necessity. And so Yoda gave the order. The Jedi became generals. From that moment on, the line between guardians and soldiers vanished. The war spread faster than prophecy. Yoda traveled from system to system, not as a mystic seeking balance, but as a commander directing battles. His presence inspired troops, men who saw him as the embodiment of the Republic's faith. Yet beneath that hope, Yoda saw tragedy. He saw faces cloned by the millions, each carrying the same genetic fate, each believing in duty without choice. They called him General Yoda. They saluted, obeyed, died, and he wondered, silently, if they were more slaves than soldiers. Every victory hollowed him further. The Jedi Order, once a spiritual anchor for the galaxy, was now a cog in a vast war machine. Holograms of burning worlds filled the council chamber. Debates about peace turned into strategies for offense. The Force, once a whisper of life, now screamed in pain. And Yoda, the oldest of them all, could feel it dying within the currents of endless death. He fought beside his troops with honor, yes, but never with joy. When he raised his lightsaber, it was with the weight of mourning. Each fallen clone reminded him that the Republic's triumph came at a moral cost, one the Jedi refused to measure. He saw the young knights returning from the front, eyes dimmed, hearts hardened, their meditations replaced with tactics. The same peacekeepers who once negotiated treaties now led sieges. The Order's sanctity, once its strength, was dissolving in the fire of its own victories. And yet, Yoda did not rebel. He counseled patience, trust in the Force, faith that this war would end as all storms must. But in the silence of his meditation chambers, his faith began to tremble. He could no longer sense the Force as clearly. It felt fragmented, as if torn between life and destruction. The war had turned the very energy of existence into a weapon, a reflection of the Jedi's own blindness. He began to question what victory even meant. For every planet liberated, another fell. For every general slain, two more arose. The Sith were still unseen, yet their influence was everywhere, in the Senate's corruption, in the Republic's greed for control, in the clones who fought without choice. Yoda began to suspect that the war itself was not a mistake, but a design. That perhaps someone, or something, had orchestrated it all to ensnare both sides in the same trap. And he was right. Each decision the Council made, each campaign the Republic launched, seemed to play into an unseen hand. But even as Yoda's doubt grew, he found himself trapped by duty. The Jedi must lead, the Senate demanded. Without you, we fall. And so Yoda, who once taught that peace comes from letting go, now clung to the illusion of control, commanding armies to preserve a republic already rotting from within. On Kashyyyk, he fought alongside the Wookiees, beings of great loyalty and strength. The battle raged beneath towering trees, laser fire flickering through the mist like lightning. When the enemy fell and silence returned, Yoda stood upon a high branch and gazed across the battlefield, the bodies of clones and droids alike scattered below, indistinguishable in death. He felt the Force move through it all, binding life and loss, creation and decay. And in that moment, he understood. The war had become a reflection of the Force's own imbalance, a mirror of the arrogance that had taken root in the hearts of the Jedi themselves. Back on Coruscant, the Senate celebrated him as a hero. Statues were raised. Hollow speeches praised the wisdom of the Grand Master, the Republic's eternal guardian. But Yoda felt none of it. He no longer saw victory, only the growing shadow behind it. The Jedi Temple, once radiant with peace, had become a fortress, its halls echoing with the boots of soldiers instead of the chants of meditation. Even younglings were trained to fight, not to understand. Late one night, Yoda returned alone to the temple's highest chamber. He looked out over the city, a world bathed in artificial light, never sleeping, never still. He closed his eyes and reached again for the Force, desperate for clarity. What he felt chilled him to the bone. It was not the light. It was not the dark. It was silence, vast and suffocating. The Force had become a battlefield, and every side claimed to fight for its will. Yet none truly listened to it anymore. Even Yoda himself had begun to mistake duty for destiny. The realization struck like a blade. The Jedi were not guiding the Republic, they were serving it. And through their obedience, the darkness was winning. He did not yet know the name of the Shadow, the man who sat in the Senate chamber, smiling, orchestrating the fall of everything Yoda had ever built. But deep down, the Grand Master understood that something ancient was unfolding. That this war was never about territory or ideology. It was about corruption, the slow corrosion of belief. The philosopher had become the general. The teacher had become the weapon. And in fighting for peace, the Jedi had begun to destroy the very soul they swore to protect. As Yoda stood beneath the fading light of Coruscant skyline, the hum of warships filled the sky above. He watched them ascend into orbit, legions of clones heading for another battle, another victory, another illusion. His reflection glimmered faintly in the transparisteel, old, weary, burdened. He whispered to himself, almost too softly to hear. Victory, not in war, there is. But the galaxy did not hear him. It was already too late. The war was no longer a conflict between sides. It was a descent into destiny. And soon, even Yoda's wisdom would not be enough to save them from what was coming. There are sounds in history that never fade. The scream of engines over Coruscant. The hum of lightsabers igniting in sacred halls. The final breath of belief itself as it shatters beneath the weight of truth. That was the sound of the day the Jedi fell, the day the light died. It began not with thunder, but with silence. A coded phrase, hidden within the minds of soldiers bred for obedience, spoken across 1,000 battlefields at once. Order 66. 2 words that would unravel 1,000 years of peace. In that instant, the guardians of the Republic became its prey. The clones, men who had once called the Jedi Sir, Commander, General, turned their blasters upon their teachers. On distant worlds, knights were gunned down by the very troops they had led into battle. Padawans fell before they could draw their sabers. Entire battalions of Jedi vanished into the smoke of their own defense. Yoda felt it first, not through sight or sound, but through the Force itself. A tearing, a rupture, 1,000 cries extinguished at once. He staggered, clutching his chest as if his heart itself had been pierced. The Force screamed through him, alive with agony. In that moment, he saw visions of the temple burning, of children running in terror, of blades cutting through those who had sworn never to raise them against their own. He had failed, not through ignorance, but through faith. Faith in a system that had already decayed. Faith in prophecy, in doctrine, in the illusion that peace could be enforced. And now, the galaxy paid the price. When the Order reached Kashyyyk, Yoda stood amidst the Wookiee forests, surrounded by soldiers who had fought beside him for years. He turned just as their weapons rose. For a heartbeat, he looked into their eyes, and saw no hatred, only obedience. It was not malice that betrayed him. It was programming. Destiny written into their flesh before they were ever born. With a single motion, his saber ignited, a blade of green against a world of fire. The first shots burned past him, and he moved with the instinct of centuries, deflecting, retreating, surviving. When the smoke cleared, the soldiers lay still. Yoda stood alone, trembling, the weight of necessity crushing his soul. Victory felt like desecration. He fled through the jungles, guided by the force that now trembled with sorrow. The trees themselves seemed to mourn, their roots heavy with loss. As he escaped aboard a waiting vessel, he looked back at the planet below, the last place where he had believed peace was possible. Now even that was gone. Meanwhile, across the stars, Coruscant burned. The Jedi Temple, the heart of millennia of learning, had become a pyre. Its spires glowed against the night sky, collapsing under bombardment. Within its sacred halls, Darth Vader walked, his blade cutting through the last defenders of the light. Children, too young to fight, too innocent to understand, perished in the name of order. The temple, once filled with the hum of meditation, echoed now with silence and death. Yoda's ship reached the system hours later. From orbit, he saw the smoke still rising, the fire reflected against the atmosphere. He closed his eyes, not to meditate, but to grieve. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, lay in ruins. The Republic had become an empire. The Senate applauded its own enslavement. And the Sith, long hidden, now ruled in plain sight. Still, there was one thing left to do. He met with Senator Bail Organa and Obi-Wan Kenobi, two of the last souls untouched by darkness. Together, they learned the truth, that the Chancellor, Palpatine, was no mere politician. He was Darth Sidious, the phantom Yoda had felt for decades, the shadow he could never name. The realization cut deeper than any blade. The Sith had not destroyed the Republic, they had become it. The very government the Jedi had sworn to protect was the instrument of their annihilation. Yoda bowed his head. Centuries of meditation, thousands of students, a lifetime of wisdom, all undone by blindness. The Force had not failed him. He had failed to listen. There was only one path left, confrontation. He entered the Senate chamber, the vast heart of the new empire, and faced Darth Sidious at last. The two ancient powers stood beneath the hollowed dome, surrounded by the seats of a dead democracy. Lightning crackled against emerald light, thunder shaking the pillars of civilization itself. It was not merely a duel. It was the culmination of 1,000 years of balance and corruption colliding in one terrible instant. Sidious laughed as he hurled the Senate's platforms like stones, each a monument to the Republic's arrogance. Yoda leapt and struck, his movements swift as thought, his blade meeting darkness in a storm of energy. The chamber became a battlefield of gods, one fighting for control, the other for redemption. But even as their power clashed, Yoda felt the truth settle in. This battle was already lost. Not because he was weaker, but because the galaxy no longer wanted to be saved. With a final surge of the Force, he hurled Sidious back, but not in triumph. His strength failed, his body falling, his grip slipping. As he clung to the Senate's edge, he felt the Force whisper what he already knew. The time of the Jedi is over. He fled into the night. As his ship descended into exile, Yoda sat in silence. The stars stretched before him, endless, indifferent. He could still feel the faint cries of the dying through the Force, fading one by one into nothingness. The order that had survived wars, crusades, and darkness untold had fallen in a single day. Not to an army. Not to the Sith alone. But to itself. Yoda looked upon his hands, steady, aged, trembling now not from fear but from shame. So certain of themselves, the Jedi were, he whispered. So blind. He knew the war was never truly about victory or defeat. It was about revelation. The light had grown arrogant, and arrogance is the seed of its own destruction. In clinging to control, the Jedi had become the architects of their undoing. As his vessel vanished into hyperspace, the galaxy behind him burned, and with it, the last illusion of purity. The Republic was dead. The Jedi were gone. And Yoda, once the greatest of them, had become a ghost of his own faith. Yet even in despair, a flicker remained. The Force, though wounded, still lived. Somewhere in its current, beyond the reach of empires and shadows, A new hope would one day rise. But for now, all Yoda could do was vanish, not to hide, but to understand. For only in silence could he begin to face the truth of what the light had become. There are places in the galaxy where the Force breathes more deeply, where life and decay are not opposites, but partners in an endless dance. Dagobah was one such place. To most, it was a wasteland, a swamp of mist and mire, where creatures whispered in the fog and light itself seemed to drown beneath the trees. But to Yoda, it was sanctuary. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. It hid nothing of its nature. It was life, raw, unshaped, untamed. And in that chaos, he saw truth. When Yoda first arrived, the galaxy was already gone. The Republic had become an empire, and the Jedi were myths fading into whispers. He stepped from his ship onto the spongy soil, his cane sinking into the mud, and for the first time in centuries, he was no one. No master. No general. No grand counselor. Only Yoda. Only the failure who had watched the light die. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet roots and rot. Every sound, every ripple of water, every hiss of unseen life, reminded him that he was surrounded by existence that neither needed nor cared for him. Here, he would learn again what it meant to listen. He built his hut with his own hands, not through the Force, but through labor. A modest dwelling of clay and vine, barely large enough to stand in. A single fire pit, a cot, a bowl. Each act of construction was an act of surrender, a rejection of the grandeur that had blinded him. He no longer needed marble temples or vast archives. The Force, he realized, did not dwell in walls or statues. It lived in the stillness between breaths. For years, Yoda sat in silence. Meditation became not a practice of control, but of release. He no longer sought visions or answers. He let the Force move as it willed. Through its ebb and flow, he began to see what he had missed all along, that the Jedi had not fallen because they were weak, but because they had forgotten humility. They had turned the Force into a tool, a weapon, a hierarchy of power. But the Force is not meant to be ruled. It is meant to be joined. Each day, Yoda watched life unfold around him. The swamp's creatures hunted and fed, birthed and died. Even decay had purpose. From it, new growth would rise. The cycle was cruel, yet beautiful, a mirror of the Force itself. Slowly, his shame became understanding. The fall of the Jedi was not an ending, but a natural part of that same cycle. The light had died so it could be reborn in a truer form. But even in solitude, he was not alone. There was something ancient and powerful that stirred beneath the surface of Dagobah, a place where darkness pooled like oil in the soil. The Cave of Evil. Yoda found it early in his exile, drawn to it by an instinct he could not resist. The air there was colder, the shadows deeper, the very ground alive with whispering malice. It was a wound in the Force, a remnant of something ancient, long before the Jedi or the Sith. Inside, he faced visions. Not of monsters, but of himself. He saw the warrior, the master, the judge, every identity he had once clung to. And then, he saw the failure, the one who could not stop the Empire, who watched the younglings die, who had believed wisdom alone could conquer fear. The vision spoke to him in his own voice. You were never the light. You were its shadow, hiding behind it. Yoda fell to his knees, trembling. For the first time in his long life, he did not fight the darkness. He let it pass through him, and in doing so, it lost its power. The Force, he realized, was never about destruction or purity. It was balance. To deny darkness was to deny half of existence. The Jedi had sought to destroy the shadow instead of understand it. That was their greatest mistake. When he left the cave, the swamp seemed brighter. The mist no longer choked him. It embraced him. The sounds of life returned like a chorus. He had faced his greatest enemy and found it was not the Sith, nor Palpatine, nor even failure itself. It was pride. In the decades that followed, Yoda became something else. No longer the commander of armies, but a keeper of memory. He communed with the Force, and in time, voices began to answer, faint at first, then clearer. Among them was Keegan Jinn, the maverick who had once defied the Council and followed the living Force. Through Keegan's guidance, Yoda learned the deepest secret, that through acceptance, even death could be transcended. The Force was not an escape. It was a return. Under Keegan's teaching, Yoda began to prepare, not for war, but for legacy. He understood now that his role was no longer to lead, but to preserve. His failure had become his greatest lesson, and one day, it would be passed to another, someone not yet born, who would carry the hope he could no longer bear. At night, he would sit before his fire, eyes closed, the swamp alive with sound around him. He no longer sought redemption. He sought peace. Not victory, not glory, just peace. And in that peace, he found a truth older than any Jedi code.